Well, hello everyone, welcome back. It's good to see you all again. And today I want to talk quite briefly about some of the background to the Rising again, but talk particularly about the participants in the Rising and some of the plans and some of the ideas which we can hopefully discern about exactly what this Rising is meant to achieve. Now, as we said last time, the idea for a Rising is quite early, sort of a month into the war. They begin to talk about this, these radical members of the IRB. Again, they don't know how long the war's going to last. It's going to be over by Christmas. God, no, we need to get ourselves sorted out now. But it drags on and on and on. And eventually, it's really not until the middle of 1915 that they begin to get their ducks in a row and organise themselves. And remember, they're a kind of secret conspiratorial group within two other groups. So I've just left this chart up here, if you remember from last time. So as we said, within the Irish Volunteers, they are a secret conspiratorial group, but also in the IRB. They don't tell the IRB leadership what they're doing. They're also almost staging a coup within the IRB as well, which, as we said, is kind of rather old now and older, more conservative with a small c, as both of these organisations are. So I say, it's a conspiracy within a conspiracy within a conspiracy. And, certainly the leadership of the IRB, rather like the Irish Volunteers, they're not particularly keen on armed insurrection unless there's massive public support for it. Or I'd say some big kind of provocation. Now, I'd say they have various key roles on the Irish Volunteer Executive when it's created. And I just want to quickly look at the key people who are going to be involved in this. These are usually the signatories of the Proclamation of the Republic, those who are executed. And I say these are the key movers and shakers. And what I've done is actually divided them up into various types, if you like. The first group we can call, I think, the Catholic Gaelicists, I've called them. And there's two particular worth mentioning. You can see Eamon Kent and, of course, Patrick Pearse. Now, remember, these are upper middle class radicals, urban radicals. As people themselves, they are fairly typical of what you get across Europe in the late 19th century. This kind of, I say, rather romantic nationalism and so on that you have tends to be the domain of, I say, the urban middle classes in particular. And I think the most curious individual of all people involved in Easter Rising, and certainly the man most people have heard of, is Patrick Pearse. And Pearse himself is often seen as the sort of chief ideologue of this insurrection, and maybe therefore of the revolution itself going forward. Certainly later on, people will look back to Pearse as the great shining example, this kind of messianic figure, this ideal that no one can really live up to. We'll see this. And I say this is due particularly to Pearse's place as the nominal, and I think rather fanciful, to be honest, head of the Republican government, which is established by the Rising, this virtual government they establish. And his role particularly in presenting the faithful Easter proclamation, which again, I'm sure you've all seen. I've got text of this below. You can actually read the actual text of what it says. But Pearse writes this. And it's in that sense, he creates the character of the Rising, very much comes out of his mind. So what's left, the propaganda image of the Rising, and it comes out of Pearse's mind. And I say it's very much, therefore reflects Pearse's own rather extreme, rather mawkish, self-sacrificial, highly Catholicized kind of idealism. This very radical form of romantic separatism and so on. And I say, I mentioned a bit on Pearse earlier, and here is again a typical Patrick Pearse quote. It is patriotism that stirs the people. It is good for the world that such things should be done. The old heart of the earth needs to be warmed with the red wine of the battlefield's blood. So, such august homage was never before offered to God as this, the homage of millions of lives given gladly for love of country. So, I mean, that makes us in this day and age rather Stefan. But yeah, I mean, it's not untypical of people from of that generation as well, glorifying war and so on. But I say Pearce gives it this character, and the rising is fired on by this new type of extreme nationalism. This is not, as it were, a normal, rational political debate. So the Republic, for example, the ideal of the Republic isn't just another form of government. It's not a monarchy or whatever. No, it's not. It's a utopia, really. And these people are, many of them, idealists, I say extremists, whatever, fundamentalists, whatever you want to put it. But that's what they are. And remember, these are people particularly who hate politics. They hate politics. They always had kind of hated politics, the physical force side. And I suppose that's why they're launching a rising. If they, not a political party, if you like, because they believe in the ways of physical force. And what we'll see, one of the great problems with this is when these people do end up becoming martyrs and so on and heroes, how do you actually turn this kind of ecstatic utopianism that you've got in people like Pearce into a real earthly state, into a real political kind of movement? And we'll see this is, again, another theme going forward, another great kind of problem. But Roy Foster's described this. I do like Roy Foster's phrase. Roy Foster describes the Easter Rising as a result of exaltation and ecstasy. I think, yeah, you get a sense of these kind of what people are like. And I say it is informed in the minds of people like Pearce with ideas of martyrdom and Gaelic racialism, and the glorification, as you see there, of violence and death and so on. And I see you do get a sense of this from Pearce's own private school with these kids. It's very, very earnest people. I mean, let's say this provocatively, there's a bit of a Hitler Youth about all this, a bit of a communist youth movement about much of this. They want an authentic, inverted commas, dress and so on. Yeah, they're those type of people. But I say, Ruth Dudley Edwards, of course, wrote a very wonderful, controversial, fun book on Pearce. Again, if you get the chance to read it, great book, called Patrick Pearce, The Triumph of Failure. And one of my favourite quotes from the book is she said that Patrick Pearce saw the Rising as a passion play with real blood. So that's right, he was playing a role. He's almost theatrical in terms of what he was doing. But here's another quote from Pearce to say there's loads of this stuff from Pearce, which really, I think, this one really sums up his attitude. So he says, our foes are strong and wise and wary, but strong and wise and wary as they are, they cannot undo the miracles of God in creating the Gaelic race, which through our great nationalist prophets of the past have sown the seed which ripens in the bosom and blood of young men. Life springs from death, and from the graves of patriot men and women spring living nations watered by this very blood. Yeah, okay. He says as well, blood is a cleansing and sanctifying thing, and the nation that regards it as the final horror has lost its manhood. And I said there are lots of overtones of Catholicism in all of this messianic martyr syndromes. Here's what he says here. It's rather like you'll hear the echoes of a Catholic Jesus in this. One man can free a people as one man redeemed the world, which seemingly for Pearce seems to be through blood, the spilling of blood. So yeah, okay. So you can decide what you think of Pearce yourself, but I'm just going to give you an idea of the of person who, I say, Ruth Dudley Edwards would say he's a slightly unhealthy individual. You can see what she's kind of saying. But yeah, he's going to be there behind much of this as well. So Pearce is and his group, as it were, his little gang around him. We also might add to that as well other people. Again, I've told them the poets. Again, these are similar kind of background. You'll see MacDonagh, for example, was very close to Pearce, worked at his school as assistant headmaster and so on. And they're very much more into the Gaelic sort of the Gaelic revival, Gaelic language, Gaelic culture, and so on. I suppose there's less blood with these people, less sacrifice and martyrdom. I think that's one thing about them. But they're another kind of group. And again, and I remember this is the important point about this. All these little factions are coming together in one organisation. They're all sitting on one table now trying to orchestrate this rising. And you have to throw in another little faction in the shape of the IRB. And these are the two key IRB people now. Old style IRB people. Of course, they're all IRB, but these are the old style IRB people. These are your backstreet bombers. These are your men in the shadows, dynamiters. As I've written there, they don't write poetry, these guys. These are proper serious, scary guys, And I say, so you have to find a place for these people as well in the leadership of the rising, in the ideology, as it were, of the rising. Actually, Thomas Clark and Sean McDermott. I think I mentioned Sean McDermott as being signed in at the side door of a Belfast pub by one of these old IRB guys. Clark himself becomes a kind of father figure for the rising. He's actually goes to prison, as you can see, for a long time, is released and opens a little shop there right in central Dublin. And these young men come along, see him. He's just a walking kind of icon for them. But let's say these are proper physical force, old-fashioned IRB people. Now, the idea of actually who's going to, launch a rising, we mentioned this idea of co-opting the volunteers. There are also attempts as well to potentially recruit support from outside of Ireland. And the main source of this help in the ideas of the conspirators will be found in Germany. And the idea when it comes to Germany is they're going to send over a man, Roger Casement. We'll talk a bit more about Casement. Casement's a member of the British consulate. So he's Irish, but he's been part of this British imperial world. He spent a long time in Africa and South America and so on. And apparently what happens to Casement, so he tells us, he saw the horrors, as it were, of imperialism and colonialism. And I'm sure he did see some awful things. And that radicalised him. So he's quite kind of connected. And because he has lots of contacts, he makes secret contact with German intelligence. And he's the one particularly who proposes that the Germans should maybe send a force over to the west coast of Ireland to support the rising. So they should maybe send troops themselves. And also he has this idea of recruiting from Germany Irish prisoners of war in a so-called Irish brigade. So these are guys who've been fighting in the British Army, been captured, and now are in prison in Germany. And you go there, you recruit them, and they're allowed out to be, again, foot soldiers for this uprising. It sounds a bit crazy. It doesn't really work, as you'd expect. It's a complete shambles, really, because most of these guys, they're not going to fight for the Germans or with the Germans. Now in Ireland, it's a crazy idea, because they're in a German prisoner of war camp. They kind of hate the Germans, They've been captured by them, so that doesn't really go anywhere. The Germans themselves don't commit troops to this endeavour either. What they do go as far as saying, the Germans, is to give weaponry. So they will supply guns, 20,000 or so guns, lots and lots of ammunition, and that's something at least. And the idea is Casement, with arrangement with Casement, they're going to land these arms now on the west coast, and they're going to be used to arm the volunteers and other people, I'm assuming, who are going to join the rising once it's underway. So I suppose that's kind of, that's I suppose better, more practical help if you're actually going to make this insurrection work. Now, another group to throw into the mix of this little faction, or these little factions at the head of the rising, of course, are the socialists, and particularly one of the paramilitary forces in Ireland at the time, armed, organised, as you can see, these guys are pretty well drilled, is the so-called Irish Citizen Army. Now, this is a socialist paramilitary group that's been set up now, essentially in the wake of a series of strikes that take place in Dublin before the war, known as the Dublin Lockout, and they're there essentially to protect labour strikes, against strike breakers and the police and so on. And they'd pledged themselves to launch their own uprising, their own sort of Bolshevik coup, if you like, as well. But after meeting with the IRB, the man in charge of them, James Connolly, and let me put up my socialist here, here is James Connolly here, is persuaded to throw in his lot with these conspirators, with these nationalist conspirators. So he ends up joining this group as well. A lot, again, with Constance Markovich, who we can put in the socialist group as well, who again, this very strange, unique woman with her own story. You can see they're a very odd bunch, peculiar bunch of people behind the rising. Connolly himself, of course, is a native of Edinburgh. Connolly is by far the best well-known person. I mean, if you didn't know anything about this and you heard the name Connolly, that's one name you probably say, yeah, I kind of heard of him. And he, he's known in international socialist circles. But the issue always, of course, with Connolly is, why is Connolly joining what is a very conservative and very Catholic nationalist enterprise in the shape of the Rising? That has been rather bemusing to a number of historians over the years. It's almost, that despite what we often hear, the fact is that the Easter Rising and Irish nationalism generally, and Irish republicanism as well, is very right wing. It really is. They're not interested in socialism or egalitarianism and so on. There's been desperate attempts to rewrite this in Irish history, to kind of pretend that they're all kind of lefties, and it's not true at all. Very, very right wing, very conservative. So why is he chucking his lot in with these? And it seems that Connolly is able to somehow square the circle of nationalism with socialism, somehow marry the two together. Maybe some have argued, like Pearce has a kind of idealised view of this completely imagined pre-conquest Ireland, full of communal living, where everyone lives together in equality, and before the arrival of the capitalist Saxon or whatever, or the Normans or whatever it is. Again, a complete fantasy, but maybe there's something about that, a communal, rural living. I don't know, it's hard to say. Also, you could say Connolly maybe sees Dublin as a kind of rallying point for the European proletariat, in the same way the Bolsheviks will in Petrograd during the war. And you raise the standard, raise the banner. The revolution begins here, and other states, other people start joining in other European capitals. But I suppose, are they committed to socialism from the other side, as it were? I don't think they are at all. I mean, and certainly we'll see later when this new movement is formed and this Sinn Féin, they sort of codify a kind of political program and so on. This will not. Socialism will be absolutely pushed out now. I say it will be very right wing, this, and it's again a source of regret for many people, I suppose, that Connolly threw in his lot with these people and was, essentially, they never got the rewards in terms of actually the character of independent Ireland. Which again, if we have time, we maybe talk a bit about the rather parsimonious and rather reactionary nature of independent Ireland. But I think what they really wanted was these 200 men who were well armed and drilled and uniformed, and probably the best troops, by the way, of all participants on the rebel side in the Easter Rising, are this citizen army kind of group. So the big point about all this is the Rising is this very uneasy, rather curious alliance of people. It's a marriage of convenience, you'd say. And I suppose if the rebels shared anything, it was just a sense of desperation as they witnessed the rather sleepy contentment of the Irish population 2 years into the First World War. There's no sign. Remember, Home Rule's on the books now. We've a kind of done deal. We know there's going to be a bit of shenanigans with Ulster and all that, but it's going to happen very, very soon. Now, just to mention the plan for the Rising, finally, the plan for the Rising itself is actually devised by Joseph Plunkett. Now, Joseph Plunkett doesn't have any military experience at all. He says himself his only military experience was playing with toy soldiers as a child, which does not inspire confidence, let's be honest. And the idea essentially is for a nationwide rebellion supported by German arms, and it's hoped maybe German military personnel. So maybe the Germans, when they see it's going well, will now land troops in the west of Ireland. Yeah, maybe. And the idea is, in order to deflect now both the British authorities and of course everyone else, the Irish Volunteers, they don't want them to find out, the leadership of that. They don't want the IRB to find out what's going on. So it's all very, very secret. What they do is, under Pierce, as director of organisation of the Volunteers, is they call for 3 days of parades around Easter Sunday. And they're to be a cover for the rising. So 3 days of parades of volunteers in all these little provincial parts of Ireland. They're all going to march about. And there's a lot of groups marching around during the war. They're allowed to exist as a kind of home guard kind of organisation. And there'll be lots of, different bodies and that coming out during Easter to parade. So they weren't going to stand out that much. And the idea is only then, when they come out now, do you reveal the plan. When these manoeuvres are happening, then you tell them, now, the insurrection is on. This morning, our brothers in Dublin, whatever, rose up and all these other volunteers are going to join in. It's an incredibly risky strategy, as I say, when you think about it, because it's going to provoke mass desertions, potentially. People are going to say, sod this. I just come out for the Easter Sunday, we'll march about and stuff. I'm not doing this. And I say we will see this when the rising takes place. I mean, the numbers involved in the rising are nowhere near the 10 or 11,000 volunteers. And just sort of 1,500 people end up actually doing something. It's very, very small amount. So most people do seemingly seem to go home and don't bother with it. Now, despite all these desperate attempts at secrecy, what's going to happen in the end is Owen McNeill is going to hear about the plans, the head of the Irish Volunteers, and immediately then threatens to call off the volunteer manoeuvres which have been planned. This Easter gathering. But he's rather though unsure of exactly how to proceed, especially when he's informed that there are 20,000 German guns on the way and they're going to land off the west coast. Now he's kind of thinking, maybe this could kind of work. Who knows? What should I do? So he hums and haws for a while. But what really decides him to go against the rising is when there is Casement himself, is when Casement's and the ship, Casement himself is captured, and particularly the ship, the Ord, which is carrying the 20,000 weapons and all this ammunition and so on. The Royal Navy end up finding it, discovering it, and the plot is now exposed. And I say Casement himself ends up being arrested. He actually comes in on a submarine. You can see that separately from all of this. It's amazing, this ship, the Ord, what they do. They actually give it a Norwegian flag, so the British aren't going to go and raid it. They even go as far as to put Norwegian newspapers in the galley and so on. So if the British do come on and have a poke around, oh, well, it is a Norwegian ship. But anyway, it's found out. That's done now. And I say he will now move against it, McNeill. Along with Bulmer Hobson now, it will send out the countermanding order now to call off the manoeuvres for Sunday, for that Easter Sunday. So we'll send all these all out to Provincial Ireland and so on. So McNeill is actively against the rising. And it actually takes them, in Dublin itself, volunteers to basically arrest him and Hobson and hold them so they can't do any more damage to this potential rising. And of course, it's not just them now who know all about it. The British now know all about it. And they've found these guns and think, what the bloody hell's going on? And now the whole thing begins to unravel. And the British plan now is they're going to, after the holiday, the bank holiday, the plan is now they have a big list of people they're going to round up and arrest. So all the conspirators are going to be arrested, all these volunteers and so on. Any radicals they know about now are all going to be rounded up and properly interned and who knows what. So the rising is going to be snuffed out very quickly, as so many attempted Irish uprisings have been over the years. So the net's closing, as it were. And they face a very stark decision now, our conspirators. What do? Do you just give up and go into hiding now and call the whole thing off? Because it's been so compromised. Now you don't have any men now coming from Germany, you don't have any weapons. Half of the country, or most of the provincial island now, has been told not even to come out and march, called off that. What do? And the British are ready to pounce. Now, they make the fateful decision, and this is the big moment. So shorn of foreign and domestic support, they make the decision to go for it anyway. They're going to go anyway. And it's going to be launched now, this rising, heavily compromised, on the 24th of April 1916. And say the effects of that moment on modern Irish history, as we'll see, cannot be underestimated. And what we'll do next time is we'll talk about the rising itself and what happens and how it all goes wrong, and in a way how it all goes right because of its, as I say, longer term effects. Okay, everyone, so I'll see you all very soon.